welcome. I see the attendees coming in. Welcome to Cannabis Industry Insights for 2022. I can't believe we are here. We are excited for this year. We're going to be doing industry insights once a month leading up to our event. If you don't know, we have announced the dates for Cannabis, which will be in person. That'll be June 1st to 3rd at the International Center in Mississauga, and that will be in person, which will include the VIP conference, our award show at Casa Loma. We have 2 days of conference and expo. And new this year, we have a retail zone and summit and a psychedelic summit, which we had back at Niagara for Roll-Up, and it was a success. And Lucas, who is our featured speaker today, was actually one of the presenters at our first psychedelic summit. And he is here today to talk about proven business models for an emerging psychedelics industry. He'll be doing his presentation, and he's going to be taking Q&A towards the end of the webinar. So if you want to post your questions, if you have any, in the Q&A box, that'd be great. And if you want to just introduce yourselves in the chat, tell us where you're tuning in from, please do so in the chat box. Anyways, all yours, Lucas.
Great, thanks, Dania. Pleasure to be here. Thank you very much to the Cannabis team for letting me speak and to have a platform for today's talk. I may be responding to some of your questions throughout the presentation. If it requires a little bit of a deviation from what I'm speaking about, I may hold to the end. So definitely feel free to chime in if you have any questions or concerns about anything that I'm showing up on the screen as well. Okay, just gonna jump in here really quick. Perfect. Okay, got my chat all set up. Fantastic, and here we are. So today we're going to be talking about some of the proven business models that exist in this emerging industry. And when I talk about proven business models in an emerging industry, it sounds sort of a bit counterintuitive, but these are models that will certainly exist in a business. And we've drawn a lot of parallels from the psychedelic sector, from other tangential sectors, and I'm sure some of which will be sort of immediately obvious when mentioning that. Let's see here. So the business models, again, are going to be largely probably, I mean, out of necessity for the sector to operate as it currently is. And we've had some recent developments. This is a similar presentation to what was delivered at the Grow Up conference in Niagara Falls in November of last year, but with some very exciting and important updates that have recently come to light as well. So just a little bit about the speaker, which I think is generally important. So I represent CANNDELTA. I'm a CSO, which is Chief Scientific Officer and co-founder. We do a lot of regulatory licensing operations support at CANNDELTA. And we are effectively consultants for helping folks initiate and begin small businesses, as well as helping those to keep their license to be able to work with compounds like THC, CBD from cannabis, as well as other controlled substances as well that are controlled or regulated. And we've been doing so under sort of the brand PsyDelta, which is a service that we've been offering. PsyDelta, just like CANNDELTA, has a focus on cannabinoids. PsyDelta's focus in the psychedelic space. So a little bit about PsyDelta is, again, we're working with folks to help them achieve licenses or exemptions under the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act. Very quickly, just a disclaimer or disclosure about today's presentation. So there's going to be a lot of forward-looking statements, and I definitely don't think that it should necessarily be taken as sound investment advice. Definitely make your own decisions. And also important to highlight that I haven't received any financial compensation to present any of the ideas that will be discussed about today, nor is anything that I'm saying necessarily a representation of CANNDELTA or PsyDelta as well. A lot of this is going to be facts and spins on facts and my opinions about those things as well. So just a bit about myself as we're getting started. I've got a couple extra letters at the end of the name. That's because I went to school for a really long time in organic chemistry. I have a background in synthetic and medicinal organic chemistry, which basically means that for the longest time, I would try and reproduce in the lab what we would often find in nature that were compounds of interest, either for cancer leads or even at times compounds that have been isolated from plants that contain controlled substances like the coca leaf. After my academic career, I moved over to Health Canada, worked as a chemist in the inspectorate for the health products branch under the regulatory and operations and enforcement branch, or what was called ROBE at the time. My specialty is in certainly science, laboratory analysis, lab practices, synthesis, extraction, and I've left the public sector to help co-found CANNDELTA, where I do a lot of the scientific and regulatory document work as well, working with folks very, very closely to help them realize their dreams of achieving their small business goals. And again, about the company, we're based in Toronto. So we're at the corner of Queen and John, and we've got a great team of just about 20 folks, I would say just over 20, who come from different regulatory or scientific backgrounds, folks that have a laundry list of educational institutions they've attended, consultants that have previously worked at Health Canada or other parts of the food and the pharma industry. We've been working very hard over the last few years to become one of the leading cannabis regulatory advisors and subject matter experts in the field. And with that as well has been the evolution into psychedelics as an emerging industry. We've done a couple of spots in some media as well. So if you're looking to see some of that contribution to the media for Global News, CBC Radio, BNN, feel free to check out our website. We're also the official regulatory advisor to the business of cannabis as well. And now to get started. So the claim that I'm making today is that the psychedelics industry is very much trailing the cannabis industry, and that we see a lot of parallels that existed in the cannabis industry early in its infancy that now we're seeing in psychedelics, which has the potential to be positive. I think some folks generally make the comparison that they're close to in the sort of the same spot in terms of its regulatory pathway as these products are slowly making their way to market as for use in sort of medicinal purposes. But you know, what evidence do we actually have to show that this could be the case? So let's talk a little bit about this. And when we're talking about how our medical cannabis framework came into play, I think a lot of folks fail to realize that the medical cannabis framework that we have within Canada has existed for a couple of decades, right? So its infancy began in the late 90s. And if we flash up a timeline here, going back all the way to the early 1900s, cannabis was deemed illegal in Canada in 1923. So about 99 years ago, and that was after the Narcotics Drug Act Amendment Bill introduced the act to prohibit the improper use of opium and other drugs, adding cannabis amongst the ranks to opium, cocaine, and morphine as well. In 1996, there was an individual named Terrence Parker who was an epileptic and arrested for cannabis possession, specifically cultivation and trafficking, after he was caught growing cannabis to help control his seizures. So he appealed that decision. He appealed that decision about being arrested under the Canadian Charts of Rights and Freedoms, something we hear a lot about today, considering the pandemic restrictions. A lot of folks sort of refer back to this. And there was a court ruling that happened with Regina versus Parker in 97. And that court ruling, there was a landmark decision that first invalidated the cannabis prohibition for folks who require this for medical purposes. And the Ontario Superior Court found that the prohibition on cannabis was unconstitutional, as it did not contain any exemption for medical use. As we move into the 2000s, the Ontario Court of Appeal ruled that the prohibition of cannabis use infringed upon Terrence Parker's right to life, his liberty and security of the person, therefore rendering cannabis prohibition unconstitutional, effectively saying that if someone required a medicinal substance that was controlled, if they required access to that substance for medical purposes, then it was unconstitutional to say that that person wouldn't be able to access that to be able to get the help that they need. In 2001, the Canadian government enacted the first rendition of the country's medical marijuana law, and we don't typically use the term anymore. We've holistically switched to the word cannabis, but we do see remnants of this language in earlier sets of the regulations, specifically with the Marijuana for Medical Access Regulations, or the MMAR. A little known fact about the MMAR is that when we're referring to this, which was a set of regulations that allowed for licensed patients to grow their own cannabis, is that how they acquired their starting materials was from one of the original licensed producers, which often goes sort of unremarked or unnoticed, and that was actually Health Canada. So Health Canada had a site that was located in the pits of a mine somewhere, a very, very secure, undisclosed site, where they were the original growers that were providing starting material, and to some extent, probably even seeds and dried flower to those that would have licenses. And these were typically patients that would be licensed under that set of regulations. Commercial cultivation and production of industrial hemp, again, was legalized in 98. We define industrial hemp as species of cannabis that contained less than 0.3% of THC in the flowering heads. Okay, and in April 2014, the MMAR program was replaced by the Marijuana for Medical Purposes regulations by Health Canada. And this continued down into June of 2015, where the Supreme Court of Canada expanded the definition of medical cannabis to include any form of the drug. So that could be not necessarily limited to dried flower, but would also include maybe extracts or teas or infused foods, which we now call edibles. And then in 2017, the government of Canada proposed the Cannabis Act, which would legalize the possession, use, cultivation of cannabis, right? So we were allowed in this proposed act in 2017 to be able to grow at home to a certain amount, and then for licensed producers to be able to produce cannabis for not just medicinal use, but also for recreational use, and to make that available for sale to anyone that was the age of majority. Bill C-45 passed. This was supposed to come into effect on July 1st of 2018. That got pushed back because the regulations were somewhat rushed to October 17th. And then a year later, we had our Cannabis 2.0 set of regulations, which allowed for not just the dried flower in the 1.0, but also the extracts, the oils, the topicals that previously were prohibited for recreational use. So again, the important key here is that a lot of this regulatory pathway began under what was called the Section 56 exemption under the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act. So in 2013, the following regulatory changes were made to the provisions in Part C of the Food and Drugs Regulations. The clinical trials were technically the only way by which a restricted drug could be authorized for the treatment of patients. So seeing an increase in the interest in the scientific community and certain advancement in science pertaining to the efficacy and safety of some of these restricted drugs, Health Canada also granted exemptions very much on a case-by-case basis under the Section 56 for the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act, allowing a few individuals to obtain access to restricted drugs that would otherwise be restricted for medical purposes. And that's a very important key, because we're going to draw this parallel again to the psychedelics industry later on. So going back to the Health Canada departments that do exist under the Regulatory Operations and Enforcement branch, we have the Cannabis Director, which I think we're all very familiar with at this point. We have the Laboratories Directorate, Planning and Operations, Health Product Compliance Directorate, Policy and Regulatory Strategies, Medical Devices, anything like a Band-Aid or higher could be considered a medical device, consumer product safety, tobacco and pesticides, and then one that's of large interest, which is Controlled Substances and Environmental Health Directorate. So interesting is, particularly over the last year and a half, Health Canada has began to increase access to psychedelic medicines for patients facing severe mental health challenges. And this is evidenced by the ongoing recent exemptions under Section 56 under the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act, or the CDSA, the legislation that governs controlled substances in Canada, such as psychedelics. On August 4, 2020, Canada's Minister of Health permitted 4 terminally ill Canadians to obtain psilocybin, and how they obtain that is also a point of interest as well, to help alleviate anxiety and depression resulting from their conditions. Now, under Section 56 exemptions, there's not actually a pathway to get these compounds from a licensed dealer. So you have an exemption, but you're still required to either cultivate this yourself or to obtain this from other sort of undeclared sources, which it's really interesting because you're legally allowed to possess it, but you're not able to get this from a necessarily clean or regulated or licensed source. So there's been quite a few gaps in this process. And that led into, for example, the first psilocybin-assisted therapy that we saw, which was granted to Thomas Hartle from Saskatoon. He was approved for use, and the first approved for use. He is a cancer patient that is stage 4, so that's terminal. And his experience, and he's been on many panels. He's spoken, and when he speaks, it's interesting. He prefaces every bit of dialogue with the fact that he's not a public speaker, but is very much interested in talking about his experiences. That he talks about these long-lasting benefits post-treatment that he had from an exposure, which was relatively acute exposure and acute long-lasting benefits that were relatively immediate. From psilocybin-assisted therapy. Now, this is where things have definitely taken a turn for the exciting, for sure, and that's that we've seen an announcement for the Special Access Program from Health Canada. Now, the Special Access Program pertains to the regulations, amending certain regulations relating to restricted drugs. So this was published on January 5th by Health Canada of this year, so 2022, came into force the same day, and is generating a lot of excitement in the healthcare space. And it's really exciting for those that are in the industry of psychedelics, or even those that are sitting on the fence, evaluating stigma versus regulatory advancements. And these amendments allow physicians to request access to restricted drugs, such as psychedelics, which could include, for example, LSD or MDMA or psilocybin from cubensis mushrooms that contain active ingredients which have these psychedelic effects when ingested. And eligible patients, as part of their psychotherapy, would be allowed to access these. And this would be granted on a sort of a case-by-case basis for serious or life-threatening conditions when conventional treatments have failed, are unsuitable, or unavailable. So there's no guarantee that all requests will be made through the SAP program. What is interesting is some of the first Section 56 exemptions that we're going through, we're taking years to be approved. And in cases where you're working with terminally ill folks, they don't necessarily have that time. So this special access program will provide a much faster application process and review and potentially approval as well. The form to be filled out has to be completed by a practitioner, and there has to be some basis there as to why you are requesting this. So again, maybe other conventional medicines weren't effective, the effects are extremely acute, and there's scientific evidence to suggest that the use of restricted drug might actually provide some kind of long-lasting benefit. Once that form is completed by a practitioner, it actually gets faxed into Health Canada. There's not really a CTLS to submit these. It's through fax. Health Canada loves fax machines. They find it to be super secure and an efficient means of transmitting information. Less on that, I guess, as we move forward. I think they're the only institution that's still using fax machines. But moreover, as clearly outlined in the current version of the Special Access Program request form published by Health Canada, you need that relevant clinical information on the patient's current condition, medical history, comorbidities, and what specifically about a drug, such as the mechanism of action, the class, or the dosage form, makes it the best choice for patients for the program. And Health Canada will evaluate it based on those criteria and either approve or deny or request more information. So who can apply for the Special Access Program? So these forms, they have to be completed by a practitioner. So someone who is a healthcare professional that is able to write a prescription. So if we're talking about, for example, therapists, it would have to be a therapist that is able to write scripts. Okay, and they would submit that to the Special Access Program on behalf of a patient. And they're looking for situations in which the patient is exhibiting something that's serious, life-threatening condition, where conventional treatments have either failed, are unsuitable, or not available in Canada. And for those that are practitioners that are applying for this, they must ensure that patients are well informed about the risks. They understand what it is that they would be subjecting themselves to. They provide a report to Health Canada about the results of the drug and especially adverse reactions. Health Canada is very adamant about making sure that they record any kinds of adverse reactions that happen from the administration of these restricted drugs. You have to have scrupulous records in the event that you're asked to account for quantities of the drug received. So they want to ensure that they're avoiding any possibility of diversion happening into the illicit market, certainly, that they're protecting youth, much as they have done with the Cannabis Act, and that the decision to prescribe the drug is supported with evidence. And that's typically peer-reviewed scientific journals and literature provided by the manufacturer. But there's also a path here as well to allow access to drugs that are sort of outside the realm of psychedelics, perhaps unapproved drugs or drugs that aren't necessarily available in Canada. So it's not just limited to psychedelics, this particular program. Some interesting evidence in the psychedelic area for study is that we've seen over 500 patient filings in the sector right now. It's a very, very heavy area of research, not just in Canada, but across the world, specifically in the US, with some other organizations such as MAPS and Compass that are very much looking at the use of psychedelic-mediated therapies. There's a lot of work that's been done in the University of Saskatchewan, as well as Johns Hopkins as well, to publish a lot of the results from large participant clinical trials from the industry to begin to accumulate a lot of the actual scientific evidence and to try and support a lot of the anecdotal evidence that has existed for decades. So some of the things that are going to help to define, some of the points that will help to define success stories in the psychedelics industry is, for example, controlled clinical trials, and a molecule for FDA approval. So we've often talked about how in cannabis, maybe full spectrum is better. But when we're talking about the medical industry, specifically surrounding the approvals of drugs, that's not necessarily going to be an option. We're looking at individual molecules that will be approved, not something that's going to be sort of a full spectrum or cocktail or dog's breakfast of mixtures of different compounds. A lot of the companies that we're seeing in the psychedelics industry right now are very much in the nascent stages. There's a lot of folks that are focused on therapeutics, and where typically a lot of these companies would have some sort of infrastructure and services they provide. There's a lot of hype in the industry. So in the last while, there have been a number of filings for companies going public without even maybe the licenses that they'd be required to have in order to conduct a lot of the studies that they're looking to achieve and to research. So important to be looking when you're evaluating business plans is, their infrastructure, services that they'll be providing, and anyone that can achieve an FDA approval and other regulatory backings are certainly going to be ones to pay attention to. There's been a very, very strong emphasis on working with folks that are living with major depressive disorder, so for chronic treatments or acute treatments. And when we're looking at sort of success with a lot of companies that are out there, the ones that have achieved many patents could probably be better in terms of defensibility. So patents do provide definitely a line of legal defense to be able to ensure that they're protecting intellectual property. For market highlights, there are 50 public companies that have formed in the same year. And again, most of those don't necessarily have a license or a proven business model. A lot of this is being sort of conducted and done on hype. And we saw this in the cannabis industry in its early stages, in the late time of medical cannabis prior to legalization for adult use. Okay, and there's news that it's very news driven and it's very data driven as well. So the process of moving molecules from the bench to the clinic, again, is very complex. It's not necessarily easy. It requires a long list of approvals, and we're looking at isolating individual compounds to do these studies. And from what we've seen in psychedelic studies is it's not necessarily individual compounds that we would typically look at, because these are not necessarily the ones that are available from the sources. So, if we're talking about magic mushrooms, that is a natural fungi that contains many, many natural products. And there's, again, a very similar theory as we have in cannabis about an entourage effect existing with other compounds that exist within cannabis. That exist within cannabis that provide that entourage effect, such as the uptake of compounds like THC in the presence of CBD. And the number of IPOs that we've been seeing in the last year is very, very surprising. the IP landscape is certainly emerging. And, with that, as we're seeing in the cannabis industry, we're going to begin to see a lot of consolidation in the industry as well. So important to shout out here that charities are really leading the psychedelic drug movement. Partnerships in the industry are going to be key, especially where it pertains to pharmaceutical industries or those that are looking to gain access into this industry. Partnerships are going to be key for research because research is going to drive the advancement. So academic partnerships are going to be extremely important. Collecting large-scale clinical trial data will be super important, and we will see, in my opinion, a lot of emerging pharma sector needs sort of tapping into the academic sector to leverage a lot of that evidence and a lot of that data that's being collected. And now for some sort of forward-looking statements as well, is that MAPS, nonprofit organization in psychedelics and mood disorders, has led a successful phase 3 program for MDMA, and we're looking for approvals possibly in the US for as early as 2023. Compass is currently in a promising phase 2B trial for psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression, or TRD. And we have various phase 2 studies to start between the next 6 to 12 months that we're looking forward to seeing. Let's zoom in a little bit and talk about some of these compounds of interest, right? Because I think it can be a little bit confusing when we're talking about, compounds such as magic mushrooms. What does that actually mean? What are the compounds of interest that are listed there? And here we have a scheme of molecules that we'll be referring to throughout the presentation. So at number 1, we have psilocybin, active ingredient in cubensis mushrooms, isoluble ingredient. The active ingredient is actually psilocin, which is compound number 2 here, dimethyltryptamine, or commonly referred to as DMT, LSD, ibogaine, and we have ketamine here, which has a DIN, or a drug identification number, and is being used medicinally and has been for some time. And MDMA, often referred to as ecstasy, is located at number 7 here. And again, that was the subject of some of the phase 3 clinical trials that we had mentioned the slide previous. Let's focus in on mushrooms for a moment here. So when we're referring to mushrooms, the ingredient within mushrooms, the compound that exists within mushrooms is psilocybin. This was first isolated in 1957 from the Psilocybe mexicana mushroom, and has since been identified as a component of over 75 distinct mushroom species or cultivars. So psilocybin in the body converts to psilocin. It has a high affinity for an agonist. It's a serotonin receptor called 5-HT2A, and these are extremely prominent in the front part of the brain. As with brain studies that have occurred over the last centuries, how we've learned the most about brains is human injuries that have occurred to different areas in the brain. And there is one study about an individual in the early 1900s that received an injury to the prefrontal cortex. There was a railway spike that actually had got punctured sort of through his jaw and had disconnected a large part of the prefrontal cortex. And we were able to make a lot of important observations from the change in behavior from that individual as a result of that injury to the prefrontal cortex. And we found that it's again, it's the part of the brain that lies directly behind the eyes and the forehead, and it dictates a lot of the personality values that we have. So a lot of the goals and motivation. And when we're looking at, for example, long-term goals, or some kind of value congruent action, a lot of that representation is actually happening from that part of the brain. So if the prefrontal cortex is damaged, it affects personalities and the ability to orient behavior in line with values and goals. So people can be we refer to it as sort of an ADD style, a way of thinking. You're very motivated for a short period of time to achieve something until something that's more feasible and flashy sort of comes around, and then you very quickly switch goals as to what sort of your point of interest. And it can also sort of act as the FPC, as a prefrontal cortex, as providing a filter to things. So the individual that received that injury was very crass, was often swearing, and brought out a lot of the animalistic sort of instincts that we typically filter out when we're trying to act in a way that might be more civil. So again, in the folks that have depression, we notice that there's certain kinds of activity in the prefrontal cortex that is associated with having less motivation for planning, less ability to do effective problem solving, less creativity is being exhibited by folks that are living with depression, and so on. And depression is not only, necessarily associated with being under activation of the prefrontal cortex, but the volume of that part of the brain also becomes reduced as well. So the reason that psilocybin or psilocin-assisted therapy is so interesting is because it begins to activate that part of the brain, and the brain starts to undergo what's called neurogenesis. So that is the process of creating brain cells. So oftentimes psychedelics or any kind of drugs are associated with the death of brain cells. But in this case, we have some evidence that it's actually quite the opposite, that by taking psilocybin, you're helping to improve the capacity in your brain and starting to reform some of the connections, particularly in that part of the brain. And that's why there's been such a huge association with the use of psilocybin and treatment-resistant depression, or TRD. Just to jump into some of the chemistry here now, a lot of folks have asked about, what is the actual active ingredient in these mushrooms? And we often refer to psilocybin as the active ingredient, but psilocybin is the prodrug, and it's psilocin that's the active ingredient. And you can test for psilocin in mushrooms by cutting mushrooms, because what happens there is you're injuring the stalk or the stem or the cap of a mushroom. You're introducing oxygen into that flesh, that fungi flesh, and you'll get this interesting cascading polymerization reaction, basically to say that the psilocybin within there will break apart and link together, and this linked oligomer turns blue. So if you're wondering if the mushrooms that you're seeing growing maybe in some Caribbean climate are containing psilocybin, you simply need to cut them and observe them for a number of minutes, and you'll start to see a blue color develop that has been rationalized by this biomimetic pathway. So psilocybin is what we would call the prodrug. It's not necessarily the thing that does the work, it's the thing that we would administer to do the work, which converts to something else in our stomachs. So 5-HT2A, again, is the receptor there. It reacts with the serotonin receptors in the brain, which are largely located in the prefrontal cortex, which we were discussing before. And when psilocybin gets into the brain, it binds to those receptors and causes a response from those receptors, right? And those are the same ones that are associated with serotonin. So serotonin is like a happy drug. Whenever we do something that furthers our means for survival, we're rewarded with serotonin. Interestingly enough, is that there's a rapid tolerance and reduced effectiveness with these drugs. So we are seeing that there's acute, long-lasting effects after even just one treatment, but there's a lot of evidence to suggest that if you were to try and treat yourself daily, for instance, besides your ability to maybe be poorly productive, you would have a bit of a tolerance built up. So you'd start to need more, and you start to see reduced pharmacological effects. Okay. But interestingly enough, these compounds so far are largely non-addictive and considered to be relatively. So the psilocybin receptors, again, are connecting to 5-HT2A is a serotonin receptor, which plays a key role in regulating mood, sexual behavior, aggression, impulsivity, cognitive function, appetite, pain, thermoregulation, so body temperature, circadian rhythms, which are sleep patterns, and memory as well. So let's move a little bit into some of these business models now that we've developed some of the science behind this through the services that PsyDelta can offer. So one of the interesting licenses that's been largely sought after is the dealer's license. So the dealer's license is an application that you can submit to Health Canada, which would allow for the handling of controlled substances to permit possession, to permit research, cultivation, propagation, extraction, analytical testing, and administration to provide or to sell to those that require it. And now folks that, for example, have the special access program or participants of the special access program can now go to a regulated source, such as someone that holds a DL, to be able to acquire access to those compounds, whereas before they were required to either grow it themselves or to find it from an illicit source. So that's a huge improvement for a medical pathway for these compounds, such as psychedelic mushrooms. Okay, and if you wish to be someone to cultivate them or to perform the extraction or the encapsulation of these compounds, you would need a dealer's license. And a dealer's license looks very much like a Health Canada license. It comes on this little pink sheet of paper with a seal. You get a license number. It has your address there, and it would highlight a lot of the activities that you're permitted to conduct under that license type. So a very common business model would be those that are interested in cultivation. Cultivation of, let's say, fungi that contain psilocybin would be a potential business model that has, I would say, a great proof of concept. And those that might be best suited to those are folks that are very aware about cultivation of fungus, so mushroom cultivation, or those that are actively undertaking something like cannabis cultivation. You know, to be able to conduct those activities with a dealer's license that would allow you to propagate, to culture, to harvest the biomass. Okay, and mushrooms are sort of a unique example because, you know, for example, LSD is not necessarily naturally occurring. It's synthetic, and same with MDMA. So you can't grow a plant that has that. So cultivation is largely unique to the fungi, such as cubensis mushrooms. Folks with that activity permitted on their license would allow, for example, research with particular chemovars, such as phenocunting, and providing source materials to others that might be doing some further down the road manipulation of those compounds, such as extraction. Synthesis is another important one that's worth mentioning. So psilocybin, again, most easily comes from mushrooms and is not necessarily better suited for something like synthesis, but other molecules, for example, like MDMA, are going to be required to be built and synthesized within a chemistry lab. So those that are very interested in drug discovery and the development of new leads would probably be interested in something like synthesis. And what we mean by that is we have something in chemistry called high throughput screening, where we would look at an interesting natural product that we've isolated in nature that might show some kind of benefit. Maybe it's cytotoxic. It might kill certain cancer cell lines. So what we would do is we would then take that molecule and change something about it, maybe in 100 different ways, by adding an atom, taking away an atom, or replacing an atom with something else, until we get hundreds of variations, and then subjecting all of these different variations to various cell lines to see if maybe we can find some kind of lead or a target that might even be better than the natural product. So that's how a lot of drug discovery or lead generation actually happens in the pharmaceutical industry. Important also is that when we find those targets, we'll need to synthesize the drugs, which are not necessarily biologically available, or they're not available in large amounts, or they're not easily accessible. So when I was doing my master's degree, I was synthesizing drugs that, for example, were isolated from sea tunicates. A tunicate's an invertebrate animal that lives in the depths of the ocean, and the amount that existed from tunicates, basically they would take these sea animals that kind of look like a sort of a mossy sponge, throw them into a blender, throw them into a column, and isolate each of the compounds that were coming out of these animals. Then they would subject those to cell lines, but the amounts that were coming out were very, very small. It would almost be trace amounts. So it's not necessarily feasible to go and collect 100, 200, 500 kilograms of these animals. It'd also be very devastating for the species, and it's probably very cost prohibitive. But it is very simple to make those compounds in a lab using glassware and commercially available products. Now we've explained what natural product sort of synthesis is like. There was a very interesting synthesis that was published just last month for MDMA. So this was published by the folks at MAPS. It was done in an open access journal, and it's very, very interesting what they've reported here, because they've given the synthesis of CGMP, so current good manufacturing practices compliant synthesis, in high yield, in large scale as well. So this is, I think, is very important to recognize, because they've made this information publicly available, how to access this particular drug. Now, when clandestine labs, a CLAN lab is, for example, an illegal laboratory that's synthesizing these things without any kind of licenses, and then typically selling these on the illicit market, they're able to tell what kind of materials that they'd been using, which were often sort of controlled substances, or even just things that were available at hardware stores like Canadian Tire or Home Depot. What they would do is they would find these compounds on the street, look at a lot of the impurities, and they would have a strong understanding as to what pathway or chemical pathway that the chemists from these labs had used to acquire access to these drugs, which is very interesting. And this particular synthesis that was reported, they were getting extremely clean product and high yield with only a couple of steps here. And these are very, very easy chemical steps to undertake that, someone with maybe a year or two of chemistry experience could easily undertake and to purify these compounds. And they were able to get this to 99.5% purity, which is excellent. And it was all within the requirements for solvent limits as well, which is fantastic, and very, very few amounts of any kinds of detectable impurities. Okay, so synthesis, there's a couple of different ways of looking at synthesis as well. There's what's called biosynthesis, and we've seen a lot of hype around yeast and algae synthesis. So what folks are doing is they're changing the genetic makeup of yeast or algae to perform a certain kind of synthesis with an input to get some kind of output that might be desirable. And we can easily do this because they're very easily manipulated, both yeast and algae. The issues with biosynthesis and derivatization is that, typically has a lower cost. The yields are typically not nearly as great, and they require extremely large reaction vessels to conduct these syntheses to be able to get enough of this product at scale. And the purification steps can sometimes be very, very expensive to purify the large amounts of these big vats to get maybe a very small amount. But if done at a low cost, it could be commercially feasible to go after a biosynthetic pathway. And that contrasts most closely with, or most, I guess, sort of largely with organic synthesis or natural product chemistry. These will typically be multi-step synthesis in which we take commercial starting materials that we can get from a chemical supplier. Sometimes these would be controlled starting materials. So if you order these, you're basically immediately put onto a watch list, or you'd have to have certain approvals or licenses to possess these starting materials. And this would be very, very controlled. At each step, you're taking your product reaction and isolating the products that you'd want, and then subjecting that to a subsequent step. So there's a lot more hands-on approach here. You're not just sort of setting the yeast and forgetting about it and coming back to it when things are basically done, like when we're converting sugars into alcohol when we make wine. Okay, so these would typically have an elevated cost because of the increase of labor, but the starting materials, are controlled. But you can do these things at very large scale with very high yields. So even though it's more expensive, the results of what you're getting are typically much more pure before beginning even with the purification step in most cases. Interesting. This was the purported biosynthesis for psilocybin, which had come out a few decades ago, which listed L-tryptophan as a starting material, right? And we've seen that when feeding when giving feedstock that contains L-tryptophan to cubensis mushrooms, we do get higher amounts of psilocybin as the end result. And it's thought to have gone through this interesting biosynthetic pathway, but there's a few potential issues with this pathway. And that's that it goes through a tryptamine and then a dimethyltryptamine intermediate. So on the list of substances of interest that I had shown on an earlier slide, if this were true, this would suggest that anytime anyone has done mushrooms, right, or they've been using mushrooms in their natural form, they'd also be subjecting themselves to DMT, because DMT would be a precursor to psilocybin in this biosynthetic pathway. We have recently seen that this does potentially have some flaws, because I don't think DMT has actually successfully been isolated. Not to say that it's not there. It could be very quickly converted into psilocin and then psilocybin. But this is now sort of a more, I guess, appropriate synthesis that more closely potentially resembles what is actually happening in the plant by going through a sort of a phenolic intermediate. Okay, so in this, they would have this potential starting material for endolyl acetate, which goes for $100 for a quarter of a gram. So it's relatively expensive stuff. You subject that to a multi-step synthesis using oxalyl chloride and ether in a nice cold bath to produce this diacetate here. Then the diethylamine could be added to the acid chloride in this one-step synthesis. Now, working with the amines, it's usually very, very susceptible to difficult purification. Following a reduction with lithium aluminum hydride would give you this this dimethylamine species, but not exactly tryptophan, and then with a simple phosphorylation step, and then reduction with hydrogen gas with palladium carbon as a catalyst would yield psilocybin, and this is potentially more realistic synthesis as to what's actually happening in the fungus going through this phenolic intermediate instead of DMT. Another pathway could include extraction, and potentially a few of these activities could be conducted on the same roof for sure. But there are some folks that, as we've seen in the cannabis industry, that have a very strong focus on the area of extraction, because it does require a lot of, let's say, artistic skill to be able to hone in on extraction. And when we're talking about chemical synthesis, we would often say that those that are best at purification, of their intermediates when working through a synthesis. I mean, that's kind of what separates the adults from the children, so to speak. So again, extraction and formulation are all activities that could be conducted under a DL as well. Now, we've talked about how full spectrum has benefits, such as the entourage effects that we've seen in cannabis, and more recently in the psychedelic space that's being studied. And that's supported by the fact that there's the presence of carbolines, and for example, the introduction of an MAOI, which is a compound in DMT therapy, which can help DMT therapy to have a longer half-life and allow treatment to last a little bit longer. Those kind of full spectrum or co-drug interactions make licensing and getting approval in a regulatory pathway much more difficult. In fact, it's very unlikely that we'll see an approval for full spectrum mixtures of drugs. What we are going to be looking for in the psychedelic space particularly are those that specialize in areas such as molecular distillation from products of extraction. We're seeing a lot of ethanol extraction occur in the psychedelics industry, those that are skilled at crystallization and the preparation of dosage forms. So almost like how we'd consider a cannabis processor to be able to extract and then process those oils, distillates, or isolates into other products, there's a very analogous model also in the psychedelics industry. Encapsulation or formulation into drug's final form is another potential business model as well. And we've seen a lot of evidence of this, not only in the cannabis industry, but also in the pharmaceutical industry as well. And in health products industries such as vitamins. So again, folks that are specialized and have the equipment for encapsulation may want to consider this as a viable business model to go after and to seek. Those that are looking to, for example, conduct processing, milling, encapsulation, specifically for psilocybin for clinical trials. It'd be very important to have sort of these things properly dosed, and those that are specialized in encapsulation would certainly be able to do that. And again, throughout all of these processes, there's going to have to be a very strong respect for current good manufacturing practices, because effectively anyone with a DL or a dealer's license is acting very much like a pharmaceutical manufacturing facility. Analytical testing is another very proven business model that we've seen not only in pharma, but also in the cannabis industry that requires a special license in the cannabis industry to test cannabis products. And we're seeing a lot of folks that are doing pharmaceutical manufacturing testing, that's not in-house, maybe third-party testing, have also moved into the analytical testing space for cannabis products. And there's going to be a huge need for that as well. And that's to ensure, for example, dosage and profile match what the label is indicating, and that the COAs are all congruent with what's acceptable. We're also looking, for example, for heavy metal impurity analysis, so elemental impurities, as well as products that are coming from the extraction line, ensuring that we don't have any kind of residual solvents. And that's very important to protect the health and safety of those that would be consuming this, in the special access program as well. They'll also look at residual solvents and pesticides and microbials, and that's really important, especially in products that are coming from mushrooms. Stability studies data collection could also be another facet as well in the developing commercial market for psychedelics. And stability studies is effectively either accelerated or in real time looking at how shelf stable these compounds can be, in the sense that how much of the active ingredient will be there after certain conditions have been sort of or after certain conditions have been sort of been applied to the finished packaged product. What is the safety and efficacy of these drugs after they've effectively been sitting there after exposure to environmental conditions such as light, atmosphere, and so on. The first step for many companies in taking and collaborating is going to be with universities and healthcare professionals to help fund testing of psychedelics. So research is going to be a very, very important industry, and for psilocybin and psilocin specifically, research setting for clinical and preclinical trials is going to be super important. And to support this kind of work, the Controlled Substances Legal Regime in Canada allows investigators affiliated with such institutions to apply for an exemption from the restrictive regime to acquire controlled substances. And that would be for research or clinical purposes. And this exemption allows for investigators to acquire, to possess, and to use the controlled substances under very strict conditions. Investigators are not permitted to transport or to sell these substances if they're focused on research. And again, scrupulous record keeping is going to be required to ensure things like diversion don't occur. The investigator and the institution involved in the research are usually jointly responsible for the security of the substances that they're working with and for ensuring that substances do not leave their control, because Health Canada is very concerned about diversions into the illicit market. So preclinical work will be an area of focus for sure, and is an area of focus. It's the derivatization of potential lead compounds. So we talked about replacing, changing, eliminating, substituting atoms in a molecule to see what the impacts would be in high throughput screening, or even screening these compounds in vitro and in vivo. Looking at the neurological activity that exists from certain compounds in preclinical work is very important as well for part of the screening process. And typically these preclinical studies, they're not very large. They provide a lot of detailed information, though, about dosing and toxicity and getting a sense of what might be effective leads that will require further research, and is typically a step that would be considered before moving the test for a particular drug into human subjects. Clinical trials is something that we've mentioned several times in this presentation, and these are going to be much larger groups of individuals that will be studied here. With all the recent data that we've gotten from the preclinical work, we would then hypothesize based on that data and run everything from phases 1 to 4 clinical trials. And that data from the clinical trials can be used for submitting what's called an NDS, which is a new drug submission with Health Canada. Okay, or a new drug application if we're submitting to the FDA. And these regulatory filings are required to confirm the pharmaceutical safety and efficacy before it reaches the marketplace. So there are a lot of clinical research organizations now that are looking to get into the space, that are into the space as it pertains to psychedelic assisted therapy, and observing sort of the effects of these compounds, not just on the physiological or pharmacokinetic, pharmacodynamic levels, but also seeing what the long-lasting effects might be on the use of these substances as medical treatment. Further down the road, we expect and are seeing evidence of treatment clinics pop up as well as another business model. And particularly as it pertains to psychedelic assisted therapies, there's the treatment for addiction, tobacco, alcohol, drugs. Addiction therapy, again, has been seen to have great results when teamed up with psychedelic assisted therapies, treating folks for depression, PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety that's associated with end-of-life situations, such as terminally ill folks, anorexia, and many other mental health issues. And again, with what we've been seeing with the pandemic over the last couple of years, a lot of folks have been paying a lot more attention to conditions brought on by mental health as well, and how that's been very effective. And I think it's also very important to mention the nonprofit organizations as well. That is, in fact, a business model in itself. There are certainly a few worth mentioning. TherapSil is, I think, a very important Canadian one to mention. So TherapSil, for those who don't know, they're a nonprofit coalition dedicated to helping Canadians in medical need for access to psychedelic or psilocybin specifically assisted psychotherapy. And a lot of that is helping to treat those with end-of-life distress. So compassionate treatment for Canadians in palliative care who suffer from that distress is what Therapsil is largely targeted around. And that could be, for example, folks that have received a positive diagnosis for some kind of incurable illness, cancer, maybe those who are in remission from such diseases as well, HIV, AIDS, heart disease. And they're an organization that's been around since 1980, or sorry, they've been around for a number of years, but they've been doing some very interesting work in making sure that folks have been able to get access they need to some of these therapies that have otherwise been untreatable with conventional methods. So definitely worth mentioning there as well. Now, a lot of the adventures in mental health and wellness, can sort of be chopped up into some of these categories. So spiritual, medicinal, freeform, and recreational. This is sort of, again, sort of a very forward-thinking model, but we may see this being early to a regulatory path towards adult use for psychedelics as well. And perhaps there's even some kind of extension that we can make with some kind of maybe psychedelic tourism that might be happening within Canada. And that could be in a clinical setting where we have clinics that are set in a remote location or a location somewhere situated in nature that allow folks to sort of reconnect with nature. And while they're there at that clinic, they're also able to get access to a lot of this psychedelic assisted treatment that we've been talking about, which typically would result in or typically involve working with someone who is a psychotherapist and helping them sort of have guided experiences with psychedelic interaction. There are a couple of precedences that exist through press releases that we've collected here. So CANNDELTA assisted Nextleaf in helping with their dealer's license application. And that's very exciting for those that don't know. Nextleaf is a cannabis processor based in British Columbia. There's one here as well about a processor, Lifeist, that's based in Ontario, who also submitted an application to Health Canada for a dealer's license. That was one that we assisted with, and they put out this press release just this last year, which is interesting for the reason that it's perhaps a proof of concept that these licenses can be obtained all under one roof for those that are already in the cannabis space as well, which is very, very exciting. That's not necessarily something we would have thought about. But they're not necessarily exclusive license types that you can hold. So there's a few considerations if you were to combine a dealer's license at the same site at which you're licensed to conduct activities with cannabis, and that's, they can be at the same site, but we do want to have, for example, a way of sort of limiting access for folks that aren't necessarily required to access one area versus another. So thinking about how access can be limited, I think would be important to right of least privilege. We would require some kind of storage separation, in secure storage rooms. And again, I'll talk about some of the physical security changes that would happen when making a dealer's license application versus cannabis in a moment. But, we would need to make sure that there's less of a risk of cross-contamination. And that also involves a scrupulous sanitation protocol in shared areas to make sure that there's no concern about cross-contamination. And again, I think this is very interesting. When it comes to cannabis processing, you can't have a food processor and a cannabis processor under one roof. But currently, as it stands, because these licenses are sort of evaluated under different directorates of Health Canada now, we have the Cannabis Directorate, that these aren't exclusive from each other. So if you wanted to begin working in cannabis and in the way that you're sort of possessing it, manipulating it, cultivating it, conducting research, you want to make sure that the area in which you're applying for a dealer's license application does have suitability. And you can do that by confirming the zoning. And you're typically looking for a zoning that would be similar to what you'd have in pharma manufacturing, right? And then Health Canada, would evaluate aspects to do with your floor plan and your design, and particularly elements of your physical security. Under the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act, we're looking at a sort of a different version of the Physical Security Directive, right? So very closely resembles what cannabis used to look like with secured storages, or sort of with vaults as opposed to secured storages, and different directive, but there is a way to sort of harmonize those various layers of physical security for both the dealer's license and the cannabis license as well. And just sort of wrapping up with a couple of final thoughts here as well, is that, to continue on along the lines of hope for this industry, is that we've recently welcomed in some new health ministers, and I've pulled this article from StratCan online, in which they were discussing about the optimism that we're seeing in the psychedelic sector right now. And following the recent election, Trudeau announced the new cabinet. and it contained or had 2 new health ministers that were being appointed. So replacing the former minister, Patty Haiju, was Jean-Yves Duclos, who is a former president of the Treasury Board, replaced Haiju, and as Minister of Health, while Carolyn Bennett takes on the role of Associate Minister of Health, along with the new position of Minister of Mental Health and Addictions. So Haiju has overseen the role since 2019. She's now been moved to Minister of Indigenous Services and Minister responsible for the Federal Economic Development Agency for Northern Ontario. So, quite the change. And Duclos and Bennett stepped into the new roles with the Health Ministry as Health Canada begins its 3-year review of the Cannabis Act. So culminating in a report to be tabled in the House by the spring of 23. Health Canada is the federal agency tasked with managing the cannabis file, as we all know. And with Duclos and with Bennett moving into these roles, also comes a lot of optimism, because Duclos, even though comes from a background of economics, Bennett was a family physician for 20 years before her career in politics, and has been a very outspoken advocate for medical cannabis access. In 2011, she joined activists protesting Canada's limited Harper-era medical cannabis regulations and long-awaited wait times for approvals from Health Canada. So to have someone there who's been mobilized, who has attended protests, I think is not only encouraging for the cannabis industry itself, but also for the psychedelics industry. And we're seeing, again, some very encouraging movements, especially with the implementation and the coming into force of the Special Access Program on January 5th, 2022. So with that wraps up my presentation. I mean, if you have any specific questions about anything I presented today, I'm certainly welcome to entertain those. You can drop a message or a question in the chat. You're also welcome to contact us also. You can reach out to us at info@CANNDELTA. You're more than welcome to follow us on socials if you've liked anything that we've talked about. And if you'd like to catch us in person, there'll be a couple opportunities. Fingers crossed in 22. So we're going to be on the road at Cannabis, which is going to be in Mississauga this year, as well as the Grow Up Conference in Victoria. We're really looking forward to some opportunities to speak and to engage individuals and to have some conversations with boots on the ground. And I appreciate everyone's time and attention in attending today. And if you have any questions, I'd certainly be happy to entertain those as well.
Lucas, that was so good. Very, very informative. We do have one question I just noticed in the Q&A box. Can you see that, or do you want me to read that out loud?
If you wouldn't mind reading it, I don't have it in front of me.
Sure. It says, are you aware of a country that is cultivating cannabis, or is it Cubanus? Maybe I'm not saying that right. Cultivating mushrooms at the highest global scale. Who do they export to? What are the global challenges with the export of psilocybin for medical purposes?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm not sure if that's sort of a pointed question, but I'm not really sure. I'm not really sure what your answer is on that one. I can certainly look that one up and get back to that. Who is that from?
Jovan.
Jovan. Okay. Jovan, if you want to connect, happy to do so either on LinkedIn or through social media. Very happy to look into that. Great question.
Awesome. Okay, so I think we are just out of time. Want to thank you so much. We will be disseminating this recording to all of those who registered. We'll be putting it on our Cannabis Industry Insights webpage, and we will post it on our socials. So thank you once again. Super informative as always. Thank you to the attendees, and we'll see you next month for our next webisode.
Thanks so much, Daniel.
Thank you.